This is John Armwood. I'm back for volume 4 of our discussion on the impact of technology, race, and American culture. When we look at this discussion through the perspective of the racial experience of people of color, particularly African Americans, here in the United States. In the first discussion on this topic, we looked at the impact of World War II and technology on this struggle for civil rights, or what are universally called around the world human rights in the United States, and the impact that technology had on the United States and that struggle. Then we looked at the post-World War II period, and we talked about Brown versus education, this major Supreme Court school integration case of 1954, and we talked about how that decision was impacted by the fight against communism on an international level. And then in the last discussion, last week, we talked about the civil rights movement and how there was the coming together of interest, what many people today call interest conversion, between the civil rights protesters and the civil rights movement and African Americans, particularly in the South, and the northern globalist industrialists in the North and their news media outlets. And the coverage of the civil rights movement helped to spur the United States government, federal government, to give some support to the civil rights movement as the horrors of it were shown on television around the world. Again, we had decolonization going on in Africa and Asia, and the United States was fighting communism based in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And of course, the image of dogs attacking nonviolent protesters and children was something that hurt America's image as the so-called land of the free and home of the brave. So as a result of that convergence of interests, I would argue that legislation like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Open Housing Act, and the Immigration and Naturalization Reform Act of 1965 were passed through Congress, which ended legal segregation in the United States, and also ended segregation as in terms of immigration. Because prior to that time, if you were not of European descent, your numbers who could immigrate into the United States were greatly lower than those who could immigrate from European countries, and it was based on race. So the huge Asian migration, the huge African migration that we've seen since is a direct result of the civil rights movement. And I know a lot of more recent immigrants, of course, don't know this because they don't teach it in the schools. But I socialize with a lot of Koreans. I always bring that up. And yes, you're part of the civil rights movement too. You're direct beneficiaries from it. Well, anyway, today we're going to be looking at what's going on right now in America. And we're going to discuss some very pragmatic strategies for moving forward based upon the lessons that we have learned here through our past experience. And the specific topic for today's discussion is lessons from the civil rights movement, interest convergence versus class struggle. Now, what do I mean by this? Most people of African American descent, most people of Hispanic American descent, Indigenous American descent, and actually those two, Hispanic American and Indigenous American, to a large extent, those lines cross. Because when we're talking about, as an example, Mexican immigrants, they're truly not immigrants. This is their land. You know, half of Mexico was stolen at gunpoint in the Mexican Cession of 1848. 1844, excuse me. And in 1848, Abraham Lincoln talked about how it was stolen by lies by President Polk at the time to start the war. And they really wanted, the United States wanted, under the banner of Manifest Destiny, to steal the harbors of San Diego and San Francisco from Mexico and all the land in between, which they did at gunpoint. We hear the Marine song from the Halls of Montezuma. The Halls of Montezuma are in Mexico City, where American troops marched and demanded that the president of Mexico sign the Mexican Cession, granting the United States all the territory from west of Texas to San Francisco. That was all part of Mexico, the richest area. The United States impoverished Mexico by warfare. But today, I want to focus on how we as peoples of color, whether we be Asian, African, of African descent, of mixed descent, of Hispanic descent, which can be anything from Euro to African, how we have a common interest, and that many whites on the left have continually tried to co-opt our interest and get us to look at the struggle as being one of class struggle. And of course, class struggle is a term that was first talked about by Karl Marx in the late 1840s, of course, in his famous work, The Communist Manifesto. And since the fall of communism in Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union and the breakaway and independence and the overthrow of communism in the Eastern European bloc, communism has become a bad word. So a lot of leftists will lie about their Marxist roots and their Marxist philosophy. Basically what Marx argued, that all social interactions are in reaction to who owns the means of production. Who owns the economy? Who owns the businesses? There's a lot of truth in what Marx said, don't get me wrong. But to focus just on class places our struggle as peoples of color in the Americas in a crazy situation. Because our struggle has not been just one of class, it's been one of status. Whites have received racial benefits irrespective of their overall class struggle. The poorest whites can look down on people of color and say to themselves, they're better than them. That's one benefit. A second benefit is in jobs. There have been historically whites-only jobs. To this day, there are positions where you see very few black people, very few Hispanic people. And they resent the fact that a lot of Asians have come into some of these jobs, like accounting as an example. So it's not just a question of class, it's also a question of caste. And sometimes those two intersect, but not all the time. So when we look at strategies for overcoming this, we have to be pragmatic. We have to make alliances not just based on class. We can't depend on the white working class to side with us or help us. A lot of white leftists want to lump us all together and say we are of one common interest. We may have an economic interest that's common, in fact I think we do, but economic interest is not the only interest. The difference between Marxists and those of us who understand Marx and have learned a lot from him, but reject his basic premise, is that everything can be reduced to class conflict, to class struggle. When in fact, in terms of our experience, the color of our skin has mattered more than anything else. Just recently in the news, what's his name? Van Reems was at his own home and got called, the police called on him. He's not a member of the traditional working class. He's a wealthy African American. But as we all know, and many whites don't get, that the difference between Van Reems and the poor black person on the street is not very much in the eyes of white people. We are just another N-word. Whether he has money or not, it doesn't matter. Now, his money may help him later on, and it clearly helped a guy like O.J. Simpson, don't get me wrong. But if you've been shot dead, or you're a professor at Harvard, and you're arrested in your own home, again, being accused of breaking into your own home, as the name just drops off my mind, but the Harvard professor, remember the beer summit during the Obama years, and I can see his face, it just drops out of my head for right now, but you know what I'm talking about. This is common. I don't know too many black people who have not encountered what Emory University philosophy professor George Yancey calls the white gaze. And that white gaze is irrespective of class. Now, many black people, myself included, when we were younger, were tempted by the Marxist analysis because leftists and others and communists sought to recruit us. And historically, we can look at W.E.B. Du Bois, who early on was even a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. But as he saw over time that these white folks, these socialists and the communists, were white folks. Even though they would mouth the words of interest in our struggle and caring in our struggle, they had to be in control ultimately. So people like W.E. Du Bois, the great writer Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison of the Invisible Man fame, and James Baldwin, that's just domestically. They flirted with communism, with socialism, and some of us still have strong socialist leanings and believe that that some kind of democratic socialist society would be ideal. We know for us, race comes first. And it's not just black folks in America. Black folks in the Caribbean, great writers like Eric Williams from Trinidad, his monumental work, Capitalism and Slavery. Even black communists recognize this, like Walter Rodney, the late Walter Rodney from the Caribbean. And in Africa, you have people like the late leader of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré of Guinea, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Emile Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, all understood that for us, the primary issue is race, not class. And that sometimes it is in our interest to look at the world in more pluralistic terms. It's more of the model of people writing in political science like David Easton. He did a systems analysis of politics back in the 1960s. People would argue that there are various interest groups and that we have to play one against the other and make alliances, though they may be temporary on specific issues, to get specific pieces of legislation passed that can benefit us. We most recently saw that with the Affordable Care Act with President Obama, juggling various interests irrespective of their class interest, to gain enough votes in Congress to get the bills passed. It involved compromise, trade-offs to make people happy. Sometimes you have to deal with the so-called business elites so you can get things done. Why? Because people's lives are on the line. Ideology is a luxury that people of color don't have. Using a strict ideology is for what we used to call, when I was younger, armchair revolutionaries. But folks who are dealing with day-to-day survival issues, healthcare, education, fighting for a decent minimum wage, we have to make alliances where we can. So these issues are addressed. We don't care who our allies may be on this specific issue. Yes, they may be temporary. And a lot of times there will be with those who are on the left, who are white. No question about it. We have more in common with those folks than we do with a whole lot of other different interest groups who happen to be white. But we must understand that we must put our own interests first and not base it on ideology, but base it on utility. What will work in that particular situation? And that's all I have to say. We have to be pragmatic. We have the fall elections coming up. We need to elect Democrats to Congress. Even though I'm mad as all get out at Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer for attacking Maxine Waters when she talked about confronting members of the Trump administration over their violations of human rights with immigrants. No, we don't have to be polite to them. Schumer and Pelosi are wrong. In fact, I believe that we should get them out of power. There's a good chance with Pelosi. Unfortunately, Schumer, as I call him, Chuck, where's the camera? Schumer is loved in New York by many, many groups of people. And getting him out would be very, very difficult. But we need to pressure him as much as possible and let him know that his statements about Maxine Waters are unacceptable, and he's going to pay a price for them. That we are not going to always side with him if it's not in our interest, and if we have a chance to defeat him with someone who is more aligned with our interests, we will. And that's the bottom line. So when I sometimes say withhold the vote, I'm talking about withholding the vote as a means of holding politicians accountable. I've never missed a primary or an election since 1972, when I was first eligible to vote, and I proudly say I voted for George McGovern over Richard Nixon. So I vote all the time. I lived in Korea, and I voted every primary and general election by mail. In fact, I organized Americans, irrespective of class or race, to vote for President Obama in 2008 while I was in Busan, Korea. So I understand that, but we have to be strategic. Have a good day. Please hit the like button if you liked it. If you don't like it, I think you know what to do. I don't have to tell you. Subscribe to the channel and also hit the notification button so you will receive updates when I post a new video. And I will be posting videos, as I have been for the past 2 or 3 weeks, at least one a week, sometimes 2 a week, depending on my schedule. So I hope to see you soon. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave comments. If there are any issues you want me to discuss, please leave them below, and I'll see you in the next video.